Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us at the side event on the topic of capacity building of indigenous peoples in multilateral diplomacy, existing practices, and cooperation prospects. My name is Alexei Tsikarev. I'm a member of the Karelian community from the northwest of the Russian Federation and previously served on MRIP and the Permanent Forum. And this is my pleasure to be a moderator of this side event, co-organized by Union of Indigenous Peoples, Soyuz, the implementation project that is a joint initiative of the Native American Rights Fund and the University of Colorado, as well as Nia Tero. We have today, thanks to DOSIP, interpretation into English, Russian, Spanish, and French. So please use your headphones in order to be on the same page with everybody else. The Indigenous Peoples agenda is increasingly integrated into multilateral diplomacy on issues of global importance, such as sustainable development, climate change, food security, language preservation, biological and cultural diversity, and traditional knowledge. In this regard, it is necessary to build up the capacity building, the capacity of indigenous peoples within the framework of multilateral cooperation of indigenous peoples with each other, the states, academic community, and other players. Specialized educational programs on human rights, civil diplomacy, economics, and environmental protection are of great importance. The side event will evaluate the existing programs in various sociocultural regions, as well as the international efforts to promote them, including strengthening internal ties and forming a community of academic friends of indigenous peoples. This event will be informed by the relevant recommendations of the Permanent Forum, and hopefully maybe new recommendations will come out of this effort. We have the pleasure today to have a number of great speakers from various sociocultural regions, academic institutions, and this is also a pleasure to have here a great number of members of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. I would like to apologize, I lost my voice, so I'll try to speak less and give the floor to as many people as possible here in order to have a good conversation. So first I would like to give the floor to the distinguished member of the Permanent Forum and former chair of the Permanent Forum, Mr. Dario Jose Mejia Montalvo, for introduction remarks. Dario, you have the floor.
Please. Hablaré en español, por favor.
Yes, I'm going to speak in Spanish. Thank you very much, Alexei, the organizers of this event. I'd like to thank specifically my friends of this panel, Elisabetta, Antonina, Elsa, Kristen, Alexei, my friend Rodrigo and Vital. Once he comes already, he joins us in this conversation in order to speak about the subject that is of the utmost importance, not only for indigenous peoples, but also, I think that generally speaking, for life on the planet, that is in this so critical moment we are living now, to speak about diplomacy. It's nothing else than the art of speaking to each other, the art of expressing our feelings, the art of speaking by means of human relations and not by the means of facts and war. Diplomacy goes before war, is the main instrument, the main tool for the existence of peoples on the world. And that is, in order to speak about this, it would be worth to ask ourselves the basic question of this: what are indigenous peoples? And what are the states? Because indigenous peoples are a fact, and historic fact, they are cultural fact, and they are political fact. That expresses itself in different ways and means, with cultures, with languages, with traditions, all around the world. And they have been there previous to the conformation of the states. So indigenous peoples have, as a center of their common discussion, the territorial rights, the cultural rights, and their political rights. At the same time, what are the states? The states, as we know them nowadays, in our modern times, after the political and industrial revolutions, has also delimited territories, also has some identities, national identities, and have also juridical structures and governance structures. So in conclusion, indigenous peoples and states are phenomena of the same dimension, but with a different capacity and different reach. Differentiated by history, differentiated by the way how states were built up on with regards to how peoples were constituted, and how indigenous people have survived with their territories, in their territories, with their cultural identity, with their own methods of governance, in spite of the posterior existence of states with their borders and limits, as they exist nowadays, because nowadays obviously we have all borders with the states, but also in the states we have internal boundaries because of the division, may it federal levels or national levels or regional levels. And so these boundaries, international and the internal borders, in spite of having been imposed juridical systems, administration systems that go beyond the conformation of states. In spite of all this, I'm saying, of this historic phenomena, indigenous people still exist, and they're still existing not only on the national level, but they also exist in the international level. This seen from a historical perspective would not have been possible in another way if not had been by means of diplomacy. And diplomacy, the diplomacy of indigenous peoples, is the exercise of these capacities, of these collective capacities of meeting among them, in spite of the diversity of languages, internal differences in the countries, because very often we have different languages in the countries, but also among the regions of the world, there is also diversity of languages. And in spite of this real borders, these thematic borders, indigenous peoples have met at different moments of history, and they have made the importance of expressing themselves freely their main issue, and that is the indigenous diplomacy, the indigenous of the indigenous peoples. And this diplomacy is to be seen reflected in different places, in different moments, and it's a contribution of indigenous peoples to global democracy, to the international system. For instance, the fact that indigenous peoples have incorporated the distinction about collective subjects as part of international law is a contribution. Because if you remember, the global democracies understood initially that the rights, the prevalent or the most important laws or rights were the individual rights, liberty, property, and the different competences for development and progress. All these were the main cells, so to say, or the main atoms on which is based this individual-centric idea of. And for us, no, it's not just the individual. There is a collective subject that has in itself also the right to life and to existence, also the right to health, the health of indigenous peoples. as a collective subject. Also, the right to education, the own education of indigenous peoples, so they can keep it up, their languages, their cosmovisions from generation to generation. All these are not rights of individuals. No, they are the rights of the collective. And this incorporation to the international debate is not a contribution only for indigenous peoples. It's a contribution to the international rules. It is a contribution to global democracy. And the fact that indigenous rights are recognized, this incorporates real protection to phenomena like the expansion of the agricultural frontier, of the mining frontier, of the big process of deforestation, the enormous, huge processes of destruction of snow systems, like, for instance, the Arctic or the Antarctic region. All this means a protection. It's a mechanism of resistance or resilience. So democracy has found indigenous people its best ally, and therefore a basic element for the construction of peace on the surface of the earth. I'd like to underline these general ideas because I think that's the main debate on which we are now centered in United Nations. Indigenous peoples are not observers. They are not NGOs. Indigenous peoples are not stakeholders or could be misunderstood with other categories. No, indigenous peoples are socio-political, historical subjects with specific characteristics similar to states, but with different dimensions and different outreach. But in spite of these differences, they have potentially the capacity of contributing in the global discussions, so-called conversation on peace, democracy, etc., etc. That means the center of our conversation today about diplomacy. With this, I'd like to thank you very much for this invitation, and I think there are several experiences that have been developed on a national level, but also here in the United Nations system. Recently, the Colombian mission was developing courses in order to develop indigenous diplomacy. Elsie perhaps can share something about these achievements and progress. There can be things that can be implemented in indigenous people, not only as a measure of the government, but as part of identity. There's a difference. There is a clear difference. There is one thing is the identity of the image of the countries. Another thing is the identity of countries. Their identity, in their structure, in their diplomacy, in their ministries for foreign affairs, that they incorporate their members of indigenous peoples, but not only as members of indigenous peoples that have been educated in a Western school model, but persons that represent indigenous peoples educated in their own structures, in their own governance and education system, so they can contribute this way to have a real imagine of what the states are, a real dimension. Thank you so very much for having me with you today.
For this great introduction and for reminding us about the histories and worldviews of indigenous peoples and principles that they adhere to that are the base for the international diplomacy of indigenous peoples and the source of the international diplomacy, and the principles that are among others humility and persistence and deep knowledge of their own histories and worldviews. So, I mean, I said to you personally about my admiration about your work and legacy as a member of the Permanent Forum, and I hope there would be as many Darius as possible in the world, as many diplomats like you. So, and hopefully with these global efforts that we are thinking about, so we can achieve this goal. But also, Yeah, now I'd like to move on to our speakers that will present on the existing capacity building programs and opportunities in various regions. And my first speaker is Professor Kristen Carpenter, who is co-director of the implementation project. And of course, as we speak about the sources for international diplomacy of indigenous peoples, of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is one of them, the most important one probably. And the project Kristen's co-lead on, together with another co-director, Sue Noya of the Native American Rights Fund. So this project is trying to make it to implement the declaration here in the U.S., but also globally. And Kristen, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Alexei. And somehow I have also lost my voice. It was a very long first week, I think, for all of us. And I will try to be comprehensible. But thank you, Alexei, and also Dario, for your remarks. If indigenous diplomacy is about solidarity, I certainly feel incredible solidarity with this panel and humility with the people in this room, many of whom are the leading indigenous diplomats in the world. And it's truly a pleasure, a humbling one, to be with you. I also wanted to acknowledge Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, Desiree Cormier-Smith, from the United States. And as indigenous peoples in the U.S. are really trying to engage our national government quite a bit more in these forums, it's a pleasure to have you here. As Alexei said, I am a law professor at the University of Colorado, and that's the hat I'm wearing today. And with my partner in many things these days, Sue Noya, I do direct this project to help achieve the aims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through education and advocacy. And we'd like to thank our incredible team for supporting us, and especially Milo Salazar, who is taking photos, but he has just been a champion over the 10 days, not least for carrying around boxes of our brand new publication, the Indigenous Peoples Guide to the UN. And he doesn't want to bring those back to Colorado, so that's why there's one in front of every single one of you. But also, we're very proud of this publication. We think of it as a capacity building tool, and it's geared towards indigenous peoples in our country, that is American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian people. And it's a group of tribal leaders, especially, that we've been working with over the 6 or 7 years of our project, tribal leaders and others who've expressed an interest to participate in venues like the United Nations, but perhaps haven't had the tools, the information, the support to make that possible. And so we tried really to be responsive to the information they asked for. This was a very hard project. It's just difficult to provide indigenous peoples with information about accessing this institution that, quite frankly, has been so unfriendly to them over the years. And also about making contacts with states, including our own state, that has not always felt it important to engage with indigenous peoples in forums like this. But we were energized by indigenous peoples' insistence that they have a role to play in the UN's processes concerning peace, security, and human rights. And so I do invite you to take home copies of the guide and offer my heartfelt thanks to Honor Keeler, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation who's just walked in with her students, who worked on conceptualizing and drafting several key components. Wado, Honor. As I mentioned, we view this as a tool, but why do we need this tool? And I guess now I'll step back to consider indigenous peoples' diplomacy from 2 angles and then pass it on to others for their comments. Many, of course, of us are deeply engaged in the movement for enhanced participation at the UN. And this goes back generations to ancestors like Deskahe from the Cayuga people and others who opened the door, organizations like IITC and NARF who've been here for quite a long time. And as indigenous peoples keep up their work on this, and the movement may be finally starting to shift in their favor at both the Human Rights Council and ECOSOC, we see huge developments, but I also feel some caution, some hesitancy. When I first became a member of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples in 2017, I was appointed from North America, and I looked around the room in the Palais des Nations, and I was very surprised to see very few of the elected tribal leaders I knew from the United States. We have 574 tribal governments in the US, and there was perhaps only one in the room. I knew that most of the other 500 plus tribal leaders in the US would not have known their issues were being discussed in the halls of the UN, particularly by states and by NGOs, without their presence. It was pretty startling, and I felt that those of us there suffered from a distinct lack of accountability to the actual indigenous peoples who would be affected by decisions undertaken in Geneva or New York. Luckily, the minute I got home, tribal leaders, including Greg Bigler and others who've now left this week, invited me right away, I think insisted right away, that I come to their communities and explain what was going on. And I think this is one of the causes, one of the inspirations for the implementation project, to start making those connections and try to make sure that the indigenous peoples in our region who wanted to be in the loop would have the opportunity to go to the UN. Still, we have a long way to go, and as we move into this next phase of enhanced participation, my hope is that we are building capacity in events like this, not for inclusive participation, not merely enhancing the status of the elites, those of us who are already here every year anyway. I hope that we're really reaching the folks who are at home and would like to have more information. And I'm pretty sure this goes for all regions, although I'll ask my colleagues about that, and not just those of us in North America. Secondly, when we're building capacity for indigenous peoples diplomacy, what are we talking about? While the halls of the UN might not be familiar to some indigenous leaders, it turns out that they've been practicing diplomacy forever. I think Dario made this point. They have traditions of establishing protocols, building relationships, setting short, medium, and long-term goals, avoiding conflict through peace, navigating internal and external concerns, honoring their own values in the process. That's all diplomacy. It's indigenous diplomacy. And so the need is not to teach indigenous leaders how to be diplomats, but rather, in my view at least, to provide the space, the resources, and information that will allow them to bring their modes of diplomacy and substantive concerns to these forums, to use the instruments and institutions to advance their concerns, to encourage their young leaders and lawyers to learn about international forums. And here I'll depart from my remarks just to say for a moment, our project is involved primarily with tribal leaders, what we call tribal leaders, indigenous leaders and their staff, who both need to be fully trained to participate effectively here. We find it's just about as much about listening as it is about preparation. And also, Milo and I, especially in our classes, have come to appreciate just how important it is to be educating the next generation of lawyers, staffers, and leaders, because at least in our country, what the typical tribal lawyer will learn is federal Indian law. It's not international law. It's definitely not the skills of diplomacy, which are, of course, depart from advocacy in certain ways. Now, I will say this is a very tricky balance, because every time we support a tribal leader through the often demoralizing process of getting here to the UN, they've spent thousands of dollars, and they've gone through the registration process, which nearly, wipes them out in the process. Then they wait in line, maybe for hours, with the best hope of only having 3 minutes to speak. And then they sit there. 2 of our tribal leaders did this week. They sat there for 6 hours and were never called on. My heart breaks again for the dehumanizing, even violent, I think, quality of this process. It is the antithesis of dignity or self-determination, and my colleague Sue Noe made this point as the closing comment on the floor just a moment ago. But every time they are able to speak, and their statement brings them into relationship with another indigenous leader, allowing them to join forces to get their word out, then I feel we're on the right track. Sometimes it doesn't happen on the floor, but in the cafe or in side events, or in submissions to studies and reports, and of course, side meetings with states and others. We saw it this year, especially through efforts of US tribal leaders who were able to sit down with the State Department to explain the meeting of a particular traditional plant to them and their community, and why indigenous people have been calling for a robust treaty to come out of the WIPO process on genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, an issue that, frankly, we've had a hard time getting the United States to pay attention to for 24 years. But there they were, making the case straight to the United States. We saw it again last year when the San Carlos Apache and Australian Aboriginal leaders met here at the UN and started to work together to combat Rio Tinto and the states enabling it to destroy sacred sites. Previously, when the Sami supported the Yaqui people in repatriating the Masakova, and so many other examples of solidarity and diplomacy making a difference. This is what our project, this is what I personally am hoping to support by enhancing capacity for Indigenous peoples' diplomacy. In closing, I want to honor everyone who's been doing this since before I was born and who will hopefully have the energy to do it after my time. I also wish that diplomacy among Indigenous peoples, including participants on this panel whose countries are now in conflict, will help to forge a true understanding and peace among us. I look forward to working with you all across national and linguistic lines to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples everywhere. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Kristen, for these very powerful words. And I think they reflect the feelings and thoughts of many of us here in this room and more largely at the permanent forum session. So now I would like to speaking about the different countries and especially those not having good relationship at this moment. So I would like to go to my own home country, basically, to Russia, and ask a colleague from Russia, Elizaveta Kuznetsova, a member of the Youth Council of the Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North of Krasnoyarsk territory, to speak about a capacity building program that we have in Russia that is called School of Civic Diplomacy of Indigenous Small Numbered Peoples. And I would like to recognize that Elizaveta is herself a winner of this program's last year season. And I think the result of this we can see already, her being, at the permanent forum. So, Elizaveta, you have the floor.
Алексей Васильевич, спасибо за предоставленную.
Thank you very much, Alexei. I'm a little bit nervous speaking on this forum with so many distinguished guests, the diplomats, long-term professional diplomats. I will have a few words about the School of Civic Diplomacy, what I have learned, what activities we have conducted, and what results have been achieved so far. This is a study program called School of Civic Diplomacy. A third season has been opened a few days ago. I have studied during the second season of the school, and then to participate, the selection was in 3 stages. First, we had to follow lectures for 2 months remotely with lecturers from Russia and abroad. After 2 months, we have participated in a class of 25 people who were selected and came together in Salihard in Yamal-Nenets region. And then the last stage, the third stage, 15 persons have been selected to participate in a program in Moscow. So 25 participated in the second stage and 15 in the third stage. Participation was open to citizens of Russian Federation who are part of indigenous people. And for the third season, participation is open for anyone starting 18 years old. The project is sponsored by MGIMO University of Diplomacy, by Ministry of National Affairs, and by Association of Small Indigenous People, by regional authorities and several experts, Russian and international, from business, from academia, And the main objective of this competition is to develop the institution of public diplomacy in Russia with the further goal to promote the rights of indigenous peoples inside Russia and on the international level, to help harmonizing relationships in society, relationships between indigenous peoples and the state, indigenous peoples and the business, and indigenous peoples themselves, by developing a forum for communication and studies. This year, participants come from various regions of Russia, from various indigenous peoples. More than 400 persons from 37 regions have signed up for the first stage. And the School of Civic Diplomacy offers possibilities for representatives of indigenous people independently of their age and level of education. This school closely follows developing new international standards, new national legislation, and new practices. We have learned to conduct negotiations, to speak publicly on international forums, to make analysis of legislation, and to propose social projects. Alumni of School of Civic Diplomacy are in high demand. They quickly find jobs, and also a community of like-minded people has appeared. After my studies in the School of Civic Diplomacy, I was able to enroll in a master's program in the Academy of State Administration of Russian Federation, and my master's is dedicated to the development of the Arctic region, because the social situation is in this region is important for developing the situation, in improving the situation of the indigenous people and in Russia generally. Things that I have learned during the Civic Diplomacy Academy helped me a lot in my work and inspired me to study further and to create events for indigenous people in Krasnoyarsk Krai, where I live. I need also to mention that in autumn 2023, I have been elected in the council, civil council of the state agency on the development of indigenous peoples and northern territories, agency of Krasnoyarsk Krai. And I would like to thank the organizers of the school for this opportunity to participate in forums in Russia and abroad, like now on the 23rd session of the UN PFI. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elizaveta. And as a program director of this School of Diplomacy, I'm very happy, actually, that you and a cohort of our alumni are now able to travel to various international fora to discuss these issues and join the solidarity of indigenous peoples, indigenous movement. So I didn't want to tell about this program myself, and thankfully, so you did it, I think, even more expressly and much better than I would do. Thank you so much. Yeah, so, and now we going back to the North America region, and I would like to give the floor to Director of Indigenous Peoples Rights Program at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at the Columbia University, Elza Stamatopoulou, who also used to work as Chief of the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum, a very knowledgeable person and legitimate person to speak about the capacity building of indigenous peoples. Elsa, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, dear Alexei, for your very polite introduction to an elder here. And because somebody asked under what hats are we speaking, I will start by speaking to you as a youth that saw what indigenous peoples were doing and the movement was doing in the early 1980s, because that's when I witnessed as a young employee at the United Nations in the Human Rights Office in Geneva these efforts and how they were being done. And before that, I want to say how inspired I am by what all of you have said before. I'm really very inspired by what Dario said and Kristen and Elisaveta, and because they remind me of amazing things and ideas, you know, that are so much part of the movement. I want to say, not to expand, that diplomacy comes from Greek, you know, and I'm Greek. And it means, it is a composite word, double-eyed. So I see things with two eyes. I can see, so therefore I communicate more, you know, I bring together. So, so from the early days, going back to this historical moment, when the indigenous peoples movement came to the international arena, of course, before the meetings of the then Working Group on Indigenous Populations, they were meeting together as a caucus to discuss common issues and develop common positions. But while people were doing that, they also were integrating in those gatherings a kind of, let's call it, informal training concept. Maybe it was just a few hours, you know. It was not something that now we have evolved, right? And we do it in a fancy way, more time, etc. But they would integrate, for example, moments, hours, you know, that where they would say, okay, what is international law? What is human rights, international law? Because these were the two main things at that time that were of interest, because the main door that they had entered, and the first door, was the human rights door. And so they wanted, and so they were creating this training or knowledge creation moment, you know, amongst themselves, and they were bringing at that time some non-indigenous plus indigenous combination experts in these fields who were sharing, you know, their views and the training. So it was not formal, but it was there from the early 1980s. And as of the late 1980s, indigenous peoples had, by that time, brought to the UN their own experts in these fields that they appreciated were of interest to them. International law, human rights, anthropology, historians, international relations people. They had sent, you know, some of the indigenous younger people had gone to school and studied these areas. So you had by the late 80s, 1980s, indigenous experts in these fields, and therefore the non-indigenous academics especially stopped speaking at the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. I had to confirm this to a very important person today who, you know, works at the Permanent Forum, to say, yes, since the late 1980s, academics don't take the floor. I cannot take the floor at the Permanent Forum, and there is a reason, because the only indigenous representatives take the floor, not some academic. And the next step that I saw in terms of the training, of the visions for training, was when, after the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted, 2007, by that point it was very clear the desire, you know, to expand as well as possible the training opportunities on indigenous people's rights. And because several comments the colleagues made about what does it mean, training, Kristen also referred, it is for people who don't have 2 years to spend on a master's or 1 year. And indigenous people's rights are not offered as discipline, you know, at university easily. So in their regular education time, people have not had the opportunity to do that. So then the question is, we call something training, which is a briefer opportunity that we can absorb as being already, people who work in our areas, and we can absorb that time and offer perhaps 2 weeks or perhaps a month, who knows, to this and get this knowledge. I have I captivated 7 types of training just to share based on my knowledge of what has happened. So the first type of training that we see is organized by indigenous peoples at national level, by themselves of that in their lands, or in collaboration with other organizations that facilitate it from another country. That is the first type of training. The second is organized by indigenous peoples at global level. And here I want to mention I had a very close relation to the International Training Center of Indigenous Peoples in Greenland that was established in 1997. And I don't know if it works anymore. It doesn't. That's my impression. Exactly, it has stopped. But this is, and now we have also ELATIA, which is a program that has been established by Tepteba Foundation and offers trainings both at international level and at regional levels as well. And FIMI, the International Indigenous Women's Forum, which has established the Global School of Indigenous Women's Leadership, which is an annual program that has, as Elisabetta was saying, has a remote program, then an in-person 2-week program, and then a part where people go to their community and they carry out projects, they implement community projects. And Columbia University also, we collaborate with FIMI on that. Third kind of training is indigenous peoples organized trainings at regional level. So regional, who does that? The Sami, I know, do it, ELATIA does it, and FIMI has also done it at regional level. It's not as common as the global. Fourth is academia organized international trainings, and here I can speak in detail, but I will not because we have to go fast. Columbia University, we organize every year this immersion 2-week international program on indigenous peoples' rights and policy, where 95% of participants are indigenous persons from around the world, and they can be academics, already professors, they can be community leaders or representatives of government, indigenous governments, or persons that work for civil service in their countries or work for NGOs, occasionally corporations that we screen very well so we don't have a strange person that will destroy our environment. And so it is very interesting to have that, and people really create a real family environment, and create links amongst themselves. And often I see them at the permanent forum as well, the alumni of this program. I think there is another program in South Africa, at the university in South Africa, but I cannot tell you at which university of South Africa. Pretoria, maybe?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, Pretoria? Pretoria, okay. The fifth type is UN-organized trainings. And here I will mention, of course, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and its Indigenous Fellowship Program, which is a longer program. It's, and I think that our colleague will mention to us afterwards. Also, there is a World Intellectual Property Organization that has a fellowship for indigenous peoples for a few months. One can work there, I don't know, for 5 months, 6, maybe a year even. And the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Secretariat occasionally organized country-specific programs where it brought together indigenous leaders, civil servants, and UN agencies together to train. So that was another concept, of the training. Sixth was some kind of programming developed during COVID, electronic-based remote programs. We did at Columbia the first ever massive open online course on Indigenous peoples' rights at international level. We did that. But also, Tribal Link Foundation created one. The Office of the High Commissioner created an electronic program. And they are still available. And seventh and last, but it comes back to the history, that now, before the sessions, the annual sessions of the expert mechanism on Indigenous people's rights or the permanent forum here in New York, the week before, there are trainings that are organized, you know, that are 3-day trainings, you know, that are organized by, for example, DOSIP, or also collaboration with Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Tribal Link Foundation, and it's called also the program Access. I don't know if you have seen it. And by now, I want to conclude by saying that we have a very rich practice of trainings on Indigenous people's rights and a lot of fantastic material, and I'm very glad Kristen brought that. And a lot of, I will broaden and say that it's not just the Indigenous peoples that have to be trained. We have to train civil states, of course, to provide that, at least as a space, you know. And of course, international organizations, because we have the declaration that has been adopted, but for it to be alive, people have to know about it and converse and dialogue through diplomacy, right? Based on the text, right? So they have to know it. That's why I say, you know, everybody has to share this knowledge, know what it means. And the corporations, if they want to do projects and extract from indigenous lands, they have to know something about free, prior, and informed consent. Not to go there and just be blind and not know what this means, actually. I finish with questions. Very important that you raised for us to answer. Has there been a systematic, detailed evaluation of existing programs? If not, what are the questions we would like to explore? And who and how should do the evaluation? I recall only a study by Ford Foundation in the late 1990s, which they did apropos of the International Indigenous Peoples Program in Greenland, where they concluded that the only at that time international program was that program in Greenland. Otherwise, we do not have such a study, and it needs to be done. And I'm very excited you are creating for us the opportunity to share these ideas, you know, and to do something very practical. Then your next question, how to build sustainable programs, how these programs, I add, should balance the time limitations faced by participants in terms of the length, how long a training program should be, you know, and the second, attending various specialized programs. Should we have a 2-week program also on environment and indigenous peoples, etc.? How practical, you know, and because we have to think of all this. This has not been done in terms of, you know, brainstorming among people who have done this work. Next question, have various programs connected with each other to share knowledge, experiences, lessons? How could we do this more systematically? And I say we should start by identifying the various programs offered. We should do a scan in our world, you know, what are those programs? And then bring people together somehow to exchange knowledge and experiences and material. And some collaborations have happened, to respond to your question. For example, in order for me, I wanted to strengthen the program at Columbia, so I have built collaboration with the University of British Columbia and in Canada and the University of Auckland in New Zealand, for example, just as an example. And lastly, how about creating, you said it, a community of academic friends of indigenous people? Yes, in a big way. We have one for academic friends for MRIP and for the UN Permanent Forum. Yes, and let's do one for indigenous peoples that will give what they can, you know, in this effort. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I took a little more time. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Elsa, and really, so you have the knowledge of all these programs and that you listed. So this is very important to scan even more for for the regional, local programs because they exist, and maybe there could be even a whole, if there will be a community like a group of friends, academic friends, so they could create a website, to have all these programs that are listed. I also remember one that is run by UNITAR, the training office of the United Nations, that has this program on conflict prevention. And I think that's very, very good. Unfortunately, to the lack of money, it doesn't have training every year, but they, from time to time, they do. And they even did a training for the first composition of the permanent forum, to my understanding, because the experts, of course, they're experts, but the knowledge how to navigate the UN system is very different from their local experiences. So it's very important to also train, as you said, the states and corporations, exactly, because they need to understand the rights of indigenous peoples. So next speaker is a distinguished member of the Permanent Forum from Chile, Rodrigo Eduardo Pailalev Monard. You have the floor, Rodrigo.
Muchas gracias, Alexei.
Thank you, Alexei. Thank the organizers for inviting me to this occasion. Implementation project, Nia Tero, Soyuz. Thank you for telling me the name. And dear panelists and also all persons who have very often sacrificed their time, their free time, in order to be here. When I was invited to this event, Alexei, I thought, what can I tell you? I started to think about it, and I started to search a bit about what diplomacy is, because we work on it every day, but very often we don't have the concept in our head. And so that's I like very much what our brother Dario said. It's nothing but dialogue. It's respect for each other, and the alternative is a war. And so it is the opposite. It's a path to freedom, to peace. So it's important to distinguish between single way and multilateral diplomacy. The bilateral is the meeting between two countries, for instance. And the multilateral is a bit more complex because it's among countries, international organizations, and in this case, indigenous peoples. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I'd like to speak about is about my experience. Because starting from my own work, I can perhaps share some ideas and some ideas that can be. I worked for Chile in Geneva. I was their attaché for 3 years. Afterwards, I was representative of PFII, and then I worked with NGO, International Lawyers Organization, and now in the forum. Well, among other things I did. I mean, what I want to say is that I've been in many different places, in different positions, in different trenches, so to say, and I've been in all of them. And all this helps me to have a privileged position to understand these processes and to understand diplomacy. And this can, as I told you before, it can be seen from the point of view of governments and from the point of view of indigenous people, and that is exactly what we are doing today in this space and in the forum, generally speaking. I'd like to also emphasize some ideas that I think we have to keep in mind because they are essential for diplomacy. It's respect, dialogue. Always channels have to be open, even if among countries, between countries that are in war. And there has always have the communication. And the communication means this having information in both senses. And it is something I tell also to my brothers who to speak with too quickly, and interpreters don't have the time to deliver the message. So finally the message stuck somewhere. Only a third or half of the audience is going to understand you. The rest is not going to understand the word what you're saying. And that is also very important. All this are things to be taken to be in mind. To be humble, to know how to express things. Because it's very easy. It's very easy to get angry and say something terrible. When I was young, it used to happen to me very easy. And you see, it's very easy, and because you said what you had to say, but it's not a good advisor for diplomacy. And you have to be responsible. And here, I have a personal anecdote, because when I worked for the permanent mission of Chile, I felt lots of frustration because I could not say what I wanted actually to say. What I say, but how shall I do? And what I learned is that one can try to shape or transform a bit the language of our country, of the position we represent. Because if we have good arguments, very often people may listen better to you, to what you're saying. And anyway, it's better than not being present. It's always better to be present than to be absent. And when I speak of responsibility, I mean that when I will leave, I will say everything I'm going to burn out the planet. That was when I was young. And it was exactly the opposite. Because we were speaking about indigenous peoples, and my idea is that we have to be even more responsible, even more careful when expressing ideas. Because today I'm speaking from my people, not from the point of view of my government. So these are things you are learning with the time, and it's good to share them. Another thing I wanted to share with you is patience. The idea of patience, as you all know, and Descartes said it already, all this process, why we are here, started 100 years ago, 101 years ago. Many generations have succeeded in endeavor in this task, and it's them who were the first ones to allow us to be here, and that is why we are in this process, as we heard it before, of improving the participation of indigenous peoples in all the meetings of United Nations, in all the subjects that are interesting for us. And other things we are not even having the time to take care about. But it's not enough with congratulating us ourselves for the work. We have to see how we continue, and we continue on our path and push forward and forward every time a bit more. For instance, something again, I want to speak again about something about myself. In my when I with regards to the work and with WIPO, there is an intergovernmental committee that is has been working for more than 20 years, working on GR, TICs, and EKs, all these processes that are we have every year. And then we have the Indigenous Caucus, an organized caucus that knows what is doing, that understands indigenous knowledge from indigenous point of view, and that adds very much value to the debate. And in spite of this, there are limits. Of course, there are limits, because it may happen that one works with an agency, that the negotiators or the delegates know their square feet, but they don't have the whole vision of the whole story. And it's there where your pedagogical responsibility is to tell them that there is the declaration, that there is UNRIP existing. And I tell this because in the process, when one is discussing about the international treaty, the text, when there is no agreement, text is put into brackets. And France sustained the idea of indigenous people, an idea that was already adopted in 2007. And so they, the department in Paris, and the department for international property, were convinced that this concept was not to be used because it was not official. It went once again, respectfully, patiently, with all these values, with all these characteristics I was speaking about at the beginning. When you approach them, then these same delegates are willing to listen to you, and then they're going to understand, and they're going to change the course of the debate, or they're going to facilitate the debate in the direction it should go. Of course, it may be frustrating because this was already resolved 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Why are we still speaking about the same thing? But once again, there is where you see that the word patience and respect are so important. This is another example. And then I wanted also mention another example of our brothers of us who, working for governments, have helped a lot on our path. For instance, Francisco Cali was ambassador of his country in Germany. He was a member of a treaty body even before. That means that the path of the formation of a diplomat is complex, and the more spaces he has been working in, the better he's going to fulfill his work. The same happens with our United States colleague. He was also ambassador of the United States he was the first Cherokee ambassador in Geneva, in United Nations, and his work was very important when discussion started about MRIP. Before it was 5 members, and the issues were not decided by MRIP, but by a Human Rights Council, that is the countries. So obviously the subjects were a we did not go very into depth. But with this modification of this mandate, MRIP could start their country visits and start their assessment. So in the discussion of the mandate, Jim Carter, as ambassador of his country, participate permanently in the discussion and in this debate. With this, I want to say that all the things indigenous peoples do has behind this the commitment of everyone and each of us, because in all the trenches you may get a bullet, as we say. So all these are examples of course there would be many more, but these are the examples I know and I wanted to share with you, and that had very important effects, I think. And well, and finally, because I've been speaking already for 10 minutes, practical advice, and please forgive me for speaking in this a bit disorderly manner, because I feel that that's how I think they can share something with you. Something important, I think, and perhaps you've heard about it too, is not only participating in the sessions and intervening, but also to sit down, to network, to have a coffee. The diplomacy of tequila, as my Mexican friend says. The tequila diplomacy is very important. Parallel events. Not all important things happen in the main hall or on the plenary. That's what I encourage you. I know some of you who are here for the first time, so keep all these things in mind. Keep these advices in mind, because somebody who has been already 10 years has been learning, and all these. If I had these advices at the beginning, probably my work would have been even more meaningful. So thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you,
Rodrigo, for sharing your experience as a diplomat, actually who used to work in the official capacity, official government diplomacy, and I recently attended a Federal Bar Association meeting here in the United States, and there was like a large gathering of the lawyers, and there was a call for more lawyers working for the government, basically, because to increase understanding of the government about indigenous lawyers should work in the government too, to increase understanding of the government about these issues. How about having more diplomats from indigenous origin? So that's probably would also increase improve the diplomacies and bring the indigenous concepts of diplomacies to the international relations. So that's might be, and all those principles that Rodrigo spoke about, including respect and patience and all others. So we don't have much time, but I still want to take maybe a few comments, very short, though. And then Antonina, I will ask Antonina to make concluding remarks before we close. So anybody wants to please raise your hands. So I see one, please. I don't see, yeah, please, you can speak.
Good afternoon.
Rosalie.
Thank you, Alexei. Good afternoon. I'm Rosalie Gonzalez. I'm Chicana Kikapu. I'm from the U.S., and I'm the co-coordinator for the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas for North Region. I am one of those people that was at the MRIP when Kristen Carpenter showed up, and she's right. There has been a very low participation of Indigenous tribal elected leaders, but I want to highlight that in listening to the goals of the implementation project, I feel that not one project can do everything, And I value the focus on tribal leadership, but I also want to emphasize that in the US, 70% of us live in urban environments. We no longer live on the reservation. We're no longer represented by our tribal councils. And for that reason, historically, indigenous peoples organizations have come to exist not only in the US, but across the world. And so I feel like, please don't forget us. And we do our own organizing and efforts to engage at the UN, but I feel that we shouldn't divide ourselves. We should come in harmoniously. And so then, given the institutional memory that Elsa holds, you know, I know that Elsa has been a strong advocate for the definition of indigenous peoples to stay wide, and really, I remember being a graduate intern here in New York City with the American Indian Law Alliance when I witnessed all the fighting across the North region around representation, and it still exists, you know, this divide and lack of unity. And sometimes we're united and sometimes we're not, but you know, it affected us right before the launch of the Permanent Forum. It was 2021 here, I don't know, some office, where we held and had these discussions. But leading up to it, there were people fighting, blocking. We don't want the tribes here. We don't want the IPOs here. We don't want Treaty Council here. And the list goes on. It happened again leading up to the World Conference, this big tension around who should speak for us. National Congress of American Indians show up, arguably some felt for the first time, and that they could not override the legacy and influence of those indigenous peoples leaders, you know, from American Indian movement and all the other, again, IPOs. So moving forward, I would just say that in our warrior diplomacy, that we try to keep that balanced tone between indigenous nations who rightfully must be at the table, but also not at the expense of squashing the indigenous peoples organizations. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize Morse, please.
My voice, but I'll try. Just 2 points from my side on trainings. As a coordinator of the Indigenous Fellowship Program that Elsa has already mentioned, I just want to raise a very important point. As you may know, the Indigenous Fellowship Program, I guess, is the most comprehensive training program that we have specifically for indigenous people at the moment in the UN. It used to be only in English. And my point here is the languages. So in the past, I think it's the first couple of years of the fellowship was mainly in English. So the rest of the world, the indigenous world, didn't have access to the program. Good news, we are now in 5 languages. So the French-speaking world, the Russian-speaking world, Spanish, and very recent Portuguese have been added into the program. One thing that is also very important is that it's really interesting that we need to go to the UN to talk about us and to learn and to discuss among ourselves. But one thing that we also need to understand is we can't do this also on our own. And that is why the academic friends that you were talking, that is also one thing that we started to build in the fellowship program. There is now a built-in preparatory training program of our Indigenous Fellowship Program, because we know that the UN won't be, or maybe sometimes it's not the best way, it's not the best place to learn all these processes. So to have a space where there is an academic inputs, because of the background of the participants as well, and I'm talking now that, you know, you would have lawyers, you have leaders who have never been to university, but they are at the forefront of protecting their people. You have to fill that gap, because otherwise when you bring in people with different backgrounds and the professional experience, a lot of people get frustrated, especially in the beginning. So you have to fill that gap so that then everybody, when they come to the Geneva at some point, they are all at the same plate. And the last point I would like to raise here is the fund is also now building a portfolio and training. I'm talking about the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People. One thing that is also changing again, and thanks to those people who have come and really take seriously this kind of meeting when they provide evaluations and criticism. And we love criticism because that's where we push things from the inside. Before, we used to just bring people and put them in the meetings, you know. And there was a time that the image of the voluntary fund is like a travel agent, that that we bring in people and then, you know, let them have that experience. But we also know that we need to, in order for indigenous people to fully, directly, and effectively participate in all these processes that we get in, we better prepare them. Because the very instrument that we've been used to exclude them is the same thing that we will find out in these rooms. So we need to prepare them so that then, again, it's also a question of equality. For us to negotiate, we have to be in the same, we are, sitting in the same table and looking at each other in the same eye. But not until we don't learn that language. And again, that's why that training is very important. We can't have that much. And I would encourage you to really build strongly on what you are thinking and what you are developing, and you will have our support in whatever capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morris. And sadly, I have received a message from the conference services that we can't exceed our time for too much. So that's why, even though the conversation could have been long, and the questions that Elsa, for example, said before us and are very important, so we will continue these discussions. But I would like to give the floor to Antonina for closing remarks, and then Dario for very short last remark.
Спасибо, Алексей. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Alexei. I will try to be as brief as possible. I know that interpreters might have to move to other meetings. Dear colleagues, dear brothers and sisters, thank you very much for this substantial discussion. Developing the potential of indigenous people, especially of indigenous youth, is a very important component. Our youth is our future. They will have to develop, to build upon the achievements of previous generations of activists of indigenous peoples. This is why now we need to create all the necessary arrangements for our youth to learn skills for diplomacy, to understand issues, and the content of such programs may be different, include various specificities, regional or specificities of this on that indigenous people. But what is important for indigenous peoples is to be able to participate in national parliaments and to be competent in order to represent their community and defend the rights of their community, be it on local, national, or international levels. I don't know where you study tequila diplomacy, but I like the idea too. Thank you very much to the moderators and the implementation projects, the common initiative of Colorado University and the Indigenous Fund, and thanks to the organization Nia Tero.
Dario, please.
Definitely, diplomacy is the art of speaking. And in order to speak, we need time. Just a couple of things. I'd like to highlight a couple of things just. To be a diplomat from a state means to work for a state. And that's now I get back to my idea of what is indigenous diplomacy. You have to be indigenous. So this would be the main aspect. We have to be ourselves. So it's no worries. Actually, I didn't know that was a diplomat. It was Alexei who told me that was a diplomat. I didn't know I was. And of course, when there was the idea of having many diplomats, and well, that's something, I don't know if we are doing our job properly, but anyway, I want to invite you, first of all, to try to remember that we have to be ourselves, we have to know our history, we have to know the endeavors of our peoples, because that is the voice that makes us representative. That is indigenous diplomacy. It's just this. It's a basic element, it's a key element in every place, in the countries, and beyond our frontiers. So that is why I wish you all the best in your diplomatic work wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.
For these words, and as I said, so that I think the partners, and Nia Tero is not here, they departed already from New York, but they are in spirit with us. And we have conducted a number of discussions, informal discussions here in New York, but also in Boulder, Colorado. And we will continue to make efforts to answer those questions that are in front of us and to make everything possible for the global and local efforts of diplomacy within, with all these challenges that we have. Like in Russia, for example, we have how many, 9 time zones, basically. And so we have to manage, even time-wise, how we organize the program so people in Kamchatka and Sakhalin can still be awake when we teach. And I think today when we opened, they were already like half sleeping, but still on. And that was very good. And so what is the finance we can obtain? How can we handle this? If we obtain a finance from private sector, how can we deal that the private sector would not intervene into the substance of the programs? How we preserve this integrity and the independence of these programs, and many other issues that we have to answer. With this, I would like to thank everybody very much, all our amazing speakers and the UN mandate holders, also all the co-organizers and all attendees. This is a great number of attendees from all the regions. And also, of course, I would like to thank our DOSIP, amazing DOSIP interpreters for their excellent work, without which we couldn't do the diplomacy, and the conference services of the United Nations. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the Permanent Forum session and the rest of the day.